crack on with power cars. So let's get straight to basics. What is a power car? It's effectively a car where its build is completely reliant on how much speed you can get out of it on long straights, as opposed to its cornering ability. So let's say, for instance, we are in B class and we've got a Mustang 65. So we're very familiar with this car. It's actually a leaderboard car around Hockenheimring GP. However, the handling for that type of Mustang is actually a 4.7 grip. So it's kind of like a slash power all-rounder hybrid, and it has about 500 horsepower. So how much horsepower does an actual speed car have? Well, this one with 4.3 handling has 994 horsepower, so it's quite insane. It's quite insane, and the same goes for a couple of other cars that I've already made that I'll walk you through some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to building and tuning them. And then what I'll do is I'll start a whole new car from scratch. We'll just pick any random car, build it up to speed spec, and then see how it does. Will it match up in multiplayer lobby? So I think it should be a fun little challenge, but for the sake of this, I think we'll stick with the Mustang. So let's get in this. I can't quite remember if I actually saved the tune or not, so let's just have a quick look. Yeah, we did save it, that's good. And here's an example. So we have a 5.2 handling car, which is more of an all-rounder in B class. And then we have this, which is a bit more of a power car, obviously 4.5 handling, not much to it. But this is with a different engine swap. This is with the 7-litre V8, and truth be told, as you can see, we get 700 horsepower, but the car weighs 300 pounds more, and you know, do we really benefit in terms of handling? It's only 0.2 of handling that it's better at, so it's not really a bonus for us. So this is why we went with a very particular build, which is what exactly I shall walk you through right now. So when it comes to building a power car, first you want to get a good idea of if the car is actually worth the time and effort in trying to make it a speed car. And the best way to go about that is, no matter whether it's stock or you've already got parts on it, just immediately go over to the engine conversions. And then we're going to look at engine swap. Do not care about the drivetrain swap, okay guys? Engine swap first. And what we want to look at is the type of engines that actually appear here. So as you can see, we have gone with the 5.9 litre V8. It's a V8 racing engine. A lot of people call it the NASCAR racing engine. And the truth is, this is among one of the best engines when it comes to power and speed cars. So you will see it in loads of really high leaderboard placing cars, especially a lot of Ferraris and muscle cars. So if you want to do a speed build where it's the best bang for buck in terms of the amount of horsepower you get, the amount of PI that's used, and the amount of weight that ends up on the car, 5.9 litre V8 is the best one to go around. However, there are different types of engines for different cars. So what I strongly recommend you do is go onto the Forza Motorsport forums and look for a forum topic which is basically an engine car and engine swap list. It's been put out by Mantio Max years ago when the game first came out, and it was a great effort of him to do, and I think it's definitely worth a look at by all of you, because the truth is it gives you a very comprehensive list of what cars can have what types of engines. So in this instance, with the V8 racing engine, there are lots of muscle cars and some Ferraris which can have this car. So you can just save yourself time. Look on Mantio Max's list that he made of all the cars on it with each engine conversion possible, and it can just save you time in choosing the right type of car that you just want to experiment with. So there we go with conversions. Once you've selected that, there's no option for any other type of like turbos or things like that, because the V8 racing engine, it's all about the restrictor plates, just like Accelerate pointed out in the chat there. So let's take a look from the conversions over to the actual engine parts. So if you've got that NASCAR V8 racing engine, it's purely restrictor plates. And do you want to know the interesting thing is? The PI does not seem to change between having stock restrictor plate no restrictor plate, and then remove restrictors entirely. So very interesting. It's just one of those quirks in the game where you can get away with dumping so much power into a car without sacrificing the PI. So always bear that in mind. And if you are going to go with that V8 Racing engine, you should probably just remove all the restrictors whilst you're there as well. Like, I haven't seen a case where you sticking with the stock restrictor plate actually helps you with builds in other areas, so like with tyres or like the mechanical grip aspects of a build. So we've just gone with 994 horsepower. It's the most that you can have in this car with this engine, and it's the best build for B class. So we've got the engine sorted. What do we move on to next? Now typically on some of the power cars I've been building recently, I have not really been bothering having any front or rear aero. So this is something that can be open to debate in terms of if it's better to have some aero on the car. But for me, I found, particularly with the Ford Mustang 65 and the Mercury Cougar in B class, you can really get away with having no aero whatsoever. You're not going to benefit massively. I think it's when you go into a higher class like A class or S class where the rear spoiler can really play a part in it, because as you can see, 28 PI, that's a big dump. It's a big dump of PI. So yeah, I see you guys are talking about the Dodge Star, the Cougar OP and S class. I'll tell you what, Rufus, I want you to send me or just point me in the direction of a tune for this Cougar and S class, because I'd be more than happy to run it on Wednesday night for our open lobby. So, but back to the power build. So what do? So we've got no aero. What are we doing with tyres? We're going to keep them completely stock because it just requires too much PI. As you can see there, just to upgrade from stock to street tyre is 76 PI. It's insane. This is something that really spawns from the issue of basically making these engine swaps and then removing all the restrictor plates without the PI necessarily changing. It's just that the PI system will then react drastically once you start adding other elements to a build. So this is why we need to keep it as stock tyres. And we move on to the tyre width. Front tyre width, I always just keep it as stock for now. At least in B class, you just really don't need it because we can overcome issues of understeer through the tuning side. Rear tyre width though, this is where it gets interesting. I highly recommend that you prioritise a build where you can have at least some additional rear tyre width, because after all, with so much horsepower in the car, it's got tons of power, but are you able to apply that force from the tyres down into the road so that you can get up to speed in time? Because it's one thing to have a car that can do amazing top speed, but what about how long it takes for you to get up to a substantial speed to overtake cars in a race situation? So some builds I've noticed from other people on the leaderboards, they'll go with super skinny tyres, but this does not work for all cars. What I found with muscle cars in particular, that you want to try and upgrade them at least once. So stock is at 195, that's really on the slim side. Even for like an all-rounder car or a grit car, that's really on the slim side. So you want to try and bump it up to at least over 250. If not, try and get it closer to the range of 300. So here it says 295. But unfortunately, it's just too much PI in B class. But it's something, if you ever want to build a speed car in A class, just try and max out the rear tyre width. It's definitely going to help you, not just in applying power whilst going in a straight line, but also on your corner exit, so that there's just a little bit more grip and you don't suffer too much oversteer, which would then in turn make the TCS bog the car a lot, which is a big thing that people suffer quite a lot from. So key lesson about building a power car is make sure you invest in the rear tyre width more than any other aspect of grip. But that is that. The next thing I like to focus on is actually the platform and handling. So in this instance, we can have race brakes. There's not much of a PI difference though we see between all of these. So initially I actually tried going with stock brakes and then sport brakes and seeing if there was something else that I could add into the build which was at a cost of only 1 PI. But guess what guys, not really worth it. We can go with the race brakes with the Ford Mustang here. So that is what we have taken. Onto springs and dampers is quite simple really. Just race spring and dampers, race front anti-roll bar, and then race rear anti-roll bar. I cannot stress it enough, guys. If you want to build a really good power car that you actually want to either hit the leaderboards with, or make it a car that is genuinely competitive in different race scenarios in multiplayer lobby, then you need to be able to tune the anti-roll bars and springs to really bring the best out of the car's behaviours in terms of, does it understeer way too much under braking, or does the car swivel too much as you're on corner exit, or is the car actually too wavy as you're going in a straight line? These are all things that you can solve whilst tuning the camber, anti-roll bars, springs and the dampers. So do bear that in mind, guys. Here we come on to a very interesting topic, and I want to take a good few minutes just to talk about this if you guys don't mind. So the battle between what do you focus on, a roll cage or the weight reduction? We've already spoke about tyre width, and Rossi has agreed with me when I spoke with him. It is really good to get some rear tyre width on, more so than focusing on a roll cage. But let's examine this a little bit closer. So weight reduction, we have actually gone all the way to bring the weight all the way down to £2,116. As you can see with the stats, it doesn't say that it improves the car, particularly in much of an area. And even if we look at the stats here, so 0 to 60 is 5.2, 0 to 100 is 11.8. So that's for stock weight reduction. Let's look at race weight reduction. So the 0 to 100 moves from basically 11.8 to 11.3. I think this is the more substantial statistic that you should focus on, more so than the 0 to 60, because when you're in a race scenario, how many times are you actually going to be under 60 miles an hour? And when you're on a straight that is so short, cars are only going to 60. Really, it's about your 0 to 100, and the quarter mile statistic you can look at, but I don't think it really matters. It's more so about the 0 to 100. So we focused on this, and let's bear in mind that it's basically 21 pi difference between stock weight reduction and race weight. So 21 pi, let's bear that in mind. When we come over to the roll cages though, the difference between stock roll cage and a race roll cage, that is looking at about pretty much 50 pi. So it's a lot more expensive in terms of pi to put in. Now the statistics do tell you that there is a big benefit to it. So we've gone with street chassis roll cage in order to have the race weight reduction. But if we changed it the other way around, let's say that we made the car a bit heavier just so that we could then add on a sport chassis, is the benefit going to be that massive? Maybe, maybe not, because sometimes these statistics in game are not all that accurate. So it's something to bear in mind, guys. But some cars you can get away with using the race chassis, some cars you'll want to go with something less. But I would advise focus your PI on the rear tyres on the rear tyre width first, then move on to race weight reduction, then move on to the roll cage. The reason why the stats and PI can look so weird sometimes when you're filtering through things like the roll cage and the weight reduction for speed cars, and you don't really see this for anything else, but the reason why you see it on speed cars that sometimes the stats will move in the opposite direction than what you think is because in essence the game's thinking, well, the car actually needs sufficient weight in order to apply the power, because don't forget, it's trying to assess all the car's PI based on these stats right here. The 0 to 60 miles an hour, the 0 to 100 miles an hour. So if we find that if there's barely a difference in terms of the 0 to 60, the game's then telling us that, well, it's not much of an improvement. But bit of a weird thing, I know, it's quite weird, but just try and get your head around that. Remember that for next time. So always focus on the rear tyre width, then move on to race weight reduction if you can fit it in to the class that you're trying to build for, and then experiment with the roll cage. I think the roll cage is, unless you're in a car that is truly wild and you've spent so much time tuning it and yet you still cannot get control of it in a straight line, only then should you invest in changing your whole build to then get the roll cage in. But that is the build side of it, because the clutch, it doesn't matter. Transmission, I'd say just go for the least PI expensive one you can. And with the Ford Mustang, the 1965 one anyway, you notice that the PI actually goes down when we move over to sport transmission. And truth is, I don't think you need to fine tune every single gear. Sorry about the dog in the background, it's actually next door. My neighbour has 3 dogs, guys, so it's a bit much. I can't do anything about it though. But yeah, so little PI hack there. Go for sport transmission if you can. I'm rejecting race transmission on most of the cars that I build and tune nowadays, because sometimes you just really don't need it. You really don't need to fine tune every single gear. It's different when you go into the higher classes and especially GT cars. But if we're talking B class and A class, I wouldn't sweat over it. So let's save that PI and stick with the sport transmission. Over to the driveline on this car. I've gone with race driveline because look, even though we're saving pretty much £16, PI doesn't change. And it's one of those quirks again, because the car does not know how to assess whether the car is going to perform in a straight line better with a bit more weight or a bit less. So yeah. iBlocks, I appreciate that. Yeah, they're just hungry to see the tuning side of this. That's what the dogs are on about. I gave them a little hint earlier today. I was like, I'm going to build a Mustang, boys, you better check it out. And they're like, yeah, alright mate, alright John. But enough of me rambling on. We've moved from the upgrade side. So now you've got the principles of how to build a speed car in B class in the best possible way. It's obviously easier in A class because you have more PI to play with. But if you focus on building B class cars first, it'll actually set you up big time in terms of building really good cars in A class, S class and R class, because you obviously have more PI to play with. B class, very challenging though, so that's why it was a good challenge for me to get acquainted with them finally, because I've never touched power cars previously. But after doing it last week, I've just been itching to tell you guys how I've gone about it. So let's look at the actual tune side of things. So tyre pressure, because it's stock tyres, you pretty much just leave them at 30-30. I just brought the rear tyre pressure down by 0.5. I personally found that it helps numb the car's reaction just a little bit, which is really helpful on corner exit. I always seem to do that. Whereas if a car feels very sluggish on corner exit, sometimes I'll actually have the rear tyre pressure a little bit higher than the front. But it's kind of more to your personal preference. There's no real kind of scientific rule out there on what you're supposed to do. Onto the gearing. So we only have the sport transmission, so it's a final drive, and I'd highly recommend that you experiment with the drive whilst you're in test mode. For the record, Juicy Gerbil, the track that I tested my cars on is Road America. I found that it's the best, all round, it gives the best challenge for a speed car, because you've got 2 very significant long straights, and then after that you've actually got quite a sophisticated midsection where the infield has lots of sweeping bends and then hard 90-degree corners. So you're able to test the speed car in many different aspects, whereas on a track like Daytona, a lot of the time you're going into a hairpin, then you're shooting off. You're going into a hairpin, you're shooting off, and then you're on a giant curve. So I feel like it's a bit limited in terms of what you can do. But what I done on Road America was try and set my car for basically being a 4-gear setup, and this is a common rule across most speed cars, from B class, A class and S class. You'll typically have just 4 gears. That's what you'll find with most of the top cars done by the top guys on the leaderboards. So with the final drive, I moved this on the Ford Mustang all the way to 2.55. And even though sometimes you'll find the stat for the 0 to 100 or the top speed changes quite a bit, thing is, when are you actually going to go up to the exact top speed? It's literally going to be Le Mans Mulsanne, like the old Le Mans. That's the only track in the game where you go top speed, and you don't really need that. What you want to focus on with the power or speed car is you get a 4-gear setup, and then focus on having the gears so that on most corners, i.e. slow ones, you're actually in third gear, and then you short shift into fourth gear, and you just let the fourth gear carry you from, say, like 100 miles per hour all the way up to 200 miles per hour on most straights. So yeah, that is how you do the gearing for speed cars. Onto the alignment. So camber is 1.4 on the front, minus 1.2 on the rear. I initially experimented with having the camber actually at like -2 or -3, because I saw that Raceboy had some guides on doing speed cars many years ago. I think it was back on Forza 5, and I tried it and it didn't seem to work so well in this game. After all, the physics are a little bit different, so you know, it just is what it is. And I also actually analysed at least 5 of the best cars at Road America, and what I found is the majority of them cars, when you're driving on the main home straight, the camber is actually sitting at around -0.1, give or take a few decimals, but it's basically at -1. So that's why we've tuned to have it here. And then onto the toe, we've kept it as 0-0 on the front. The Mustang's pretty decent even without the aero parts, so we didn't need to create more oversteer by pushing any toe. Rear toe though, we've basically tried to point the tyres towards each other. So if you look at the car top down, we've got the front of the tyres, if you imagine as my fingertips, we want to point them together ever so slightly, just to help with that straight line grip and stability. So you don't need to do it on all power cars, but on this particular one, the 65 Mustang, it still gets a bit slippy even on a straight line when you're in fourth gear, believe it or not. So this really helped me punch down my lap times by close to half a second, I'm not kidding, and it also helped with the consistency. Onto the caster, we've done 7.0, and because it's really hard on transitions, especially if you use sim steering and you have traction control on. The last thing you want is moving from going through a right-hander to a left-hander, but then the car over-rotates, and then the moment you apply acceleration, the car's oversteering too much from having a low caster, then the traction control kicks in, the car bogs, and then you've lost half a second or a full second. So that's why we go with 7 degrees. Onto the anti-roll bars. I think this is just going to be a typical rule for most speed cars. Have the front anti-roll bar super stiff. You do not need to have it all the way up to 40, but for the Ford Mustang, this just felt like a happy spot for me. I had 40, and then the rear anti-roll bar is sitting bang in the middle at around 20. Springs, quite drastic, isn't it? Quite drastic. You don't really need to have springs set up like this, but I'm showing you an example of the general concept, which is you have a car which has got a serious amount of power coming from that engine. And that means unless you get sufficient weight onto them rear tyres at all times, the tyres are just going to keep on spinning, even with traction control. They're just going to keep on spinning. So you have so much power that just gets bled out. It's not being transferred to the road. So what you want to do is have a really stiff front spring, because what that will do is stop the front end of the car from actually bouncing around much, because it's got less of ability by having such a stiff spring. Whereas the rear spring is soft. It means that the bottom end can sit down a lot more. It can squat right down to the floor, and as long as you have the car squatting whilst you're in a straight line, it's actually going to have more power going from the engine to the wheel to the road. There will ultimately be more traction, and we've had to emphasize this with the ride height as well. So if you're ever building a speed car, always jack up the front ride height. Make sure it is higher than the rear by a considerable amount. You don't always need to go all the way to the top, but I'd say at least make it a couple of inches higher. Onto the damping, the bump and rebound. To be honest, it's kind of like just personal preference. I just went with these numbers, 12-12 for rebound, and then 2.2 and 2.4 for the bump. You don't really need to agonise yourself over these parts, because the rules of these apply exactly the same for a speed car compared to any other type of car. Downforce, no option available, doesn't matter to us, it's fine. Onto the braking. I think this is really going to come down to personal preference, guys, because If you want to have a car that oversteers more under braking, then sure, just make it at a lower balance number. If you want the car to understeer more under braking, then just make it higher than 50%. I just left it at 50. It just felt good to me around Road America. Would I have it the same around other tracks like Daytona? Maybe not, because the first corner of Daytona involves a lot of trail braking. So if you're doing trail braking, you'll probably want to have a slightly slower braking force balance. But brake pressure, personal preference, I just left it at 150. And finally we have the differential. So it might seem a bit bizarre that we have not got the differential all the way down to like say 30% or lower, because it's a car that's got insane amounts of power. Why haven't we done this? Well, let's break down how a straight up speed car actually behaves around corners. You're not able to use any downforce or mechanical grip to actually make wide curves whilst going through a turn. Instead, what you're doing with every corner is you're basically trying to turn them not so much into a hairpin, but more like a V shape. So you're trying to brake in a straight line, and you're not going to park exactly on the apex. You're going to purposely shoot a bit past the apex, swivel around, and the car will feel like a boat when this is happening, but you want to turn the car and then just shoot it out in a straight line. So with that said, the differential you're not needing so much aid from it, but since we do have power nonetheless, what I've done is put it down to 70%, and this actually helped give the car a bit more leeway when going in a straight line, because as I mentioned, the Ford Mustang, it likes to swerve a hell of a lot in a straight line. It's really hard to control, but I found that reducing the differential just a little bit, down to 70%, it did overall make the car just a little bit more stable as you're moving from third gear to fourth gear. But that is the tuning side of it done, guys, and just to actually give you an impression as to what a Ford Mustang can do, as I said, I tried it around Road America. I tried it around Road America Full and then Road America Full West, so let's find them. So here we are. I haven't put clean lap times down because I was literally just testing them, but these are literally all within the limits and whatnot. So we can see that with a 219.8, that would actually put us second in Europe. What does it do in the overall leaderboard though? Because that's what it matters about. We know that for power tracks, especially in the lower classes, it's actually North and South America that really love dominating these leaderboards. So we'll find that a 219, it sits us just outside of the top 11, but it'd practically be bang on the top 12. So considering the fact this Mustang, I have never seen a power Mustang in like the top 50 on any track in B class on Forza 7. So the fact that we have found it to be of use is really good news. So basically it can be top 12 or potentially better if you absolutely nail the lap. I think a 218 is kind of its limit. We're not going to be doing any of these crazy times that we see with these other cars. But, you know, a 218, 219, that's still seriously fast for Road America. Let's look at Road America West. Oh, I've gone past it. Oh, sorry, Road America Alt, sorry, not West. So on average, it's about 5 seconds slower to do this track. So 225.9. So in Europe, that kind of puts us in top 4, which is pretty cool. How does it do against the world though? So 225 would sit us above this Mazda RX-3, which we all know is just an absolute Sonic the Hedgehog wild beast of a car, especially in C class and B class. So yeah, basically top 10 potential for a Ford Mustang, and you know, no one has tried it on the leaderboards yet. I'm sure I'll put a proper lap time down at some point, but you know, we found a car which works pretty well. And in terms of the tuning, which I've explained to you guys, I followed the exact same principle on a Mercury Cougar, and it performs, I think, even slightly better than the Ford Mustang, because a lot more people used the Mercury Cougar as a speed car back on Forza 6. So I hope that helps you guys. Some other tracks that it could work on. In B class anyway, Sebring for sure. and then the shorter variations, maybe Road Atlanta, but Road Atlanta actually does require a fair amount of momentum. So I would say you're pretty much sitting at Sebring, Road America, and Monza, and then last but not least you have Daytona. Bathurst is a funny one. Bathurst, with some of the top times, you can get away with having either a full out speed car or just having an exceptionally strong all-rounder. So for example, Sora, i.e. Greek, he's got Caesar's 65 Mustang, which is 4.7 handling. So although it's a power car, it's closer to being an all-rounder rather than a power car. But there you have it, guys. That's that. So